So I can introduce our speaker, who is Dr. Chris Wild, who obtained his PhD in oncology for his work on monoclonal antibodies to study DNA damage and repair. He worked in France and the Netherlands, and then took up a post at the World Health Organization's Cancer Agency, the International Agency for Research on Cancer. He then was a chair of molecular epidemiology at the University of Leeds, and then the director of the Leeds Institute of Genomics, Health and Therapeutics, and then went back to the International Agency for Research on Cancer as its director for 10 years. His research institute has been the interplay between environmental and genetic risk factors in the causation of human cancer, and he established the concept of the expososome, a bit like the genome, thinking about exposure to risks that cause cancer, and that became a new field. Now that he's retired, he's currently working on a book called Unraveling DNA, Applying Christian Values in a Genetic Age, which is what he's going to speak to us about today.
There you are. Thank you very much, Ruth, for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for being here this afternoon, and also to those who are joining online. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I'm not going to talk about the exposome or oncology. I'm going to talk about this subject of genetics and the advances in genetics. And I've got two practical objectives this afternoon. The first is to give you an overview of all the areas where advances in genetics are permeating into everyday life, just to give you a sense of the breadth of the subject. And secondly, I'd like to put forward a way of thinking, trying to make sense of those advances to enable individual decision-making, but also collective decision-making to shape society. How can we categorize some of answers and think through a particularly Christian perspective? But before I do that, just a word or two of context. So when I started my PhD studies in 1980, looking at DNA damage in cancer, we knew that mutations in genes led to cancer, but we had no clue about the specific parts of the genome, the specific genes that were responsible for those changes in the cell. So it was 1982 that the first gene involved in the progression of cancer was identified in a human, 1982. So 7 years later, Francis Collins discovered the first gene that caused the human disease through just that single gene. That was cystic fibrosis. And 11 years after that, in the year 2000, Francis Collins was stood next to President Bill Clinton with Tony Blair on the line, announcing the full sequence of the human genome. A very rapid success, the year 2000. And that sequence is 3 billion pieces of information, 3 billion long. So it's phenomenal. That would fill 800 Bibles if you wrote it out in text form. That information is packed into each individual cell of our bodies. And then a couple of weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, this report came out in the New England Journal of Medicine, reported in The Guardian. A young child diagnosed with a life-threatening genetic disorder in a single gene. And within 6 months, the scientists had sequenced that gene, identified the fault, developed a treatment, and successfully treated the child to reverse that inherited genetic defect. So if you think within the scope of the span of one career, years, we've gone from knowing very little about human genes to being able to identify and correct genes in individuals and save the life of a child like this one. So I'm going to, at times, raise some of the challenges and the risks of some advances in genetics, but I do not want to give you the impression that the science itself is something we should be wary of, or indeed ignore some of the great benefits of this technology. So here's the outline of my talk. Try to convince you that genetics is permeating these many and changing, varied aspects of everyday life. It's actually changing humanity and the future of the world in which we live. I'm going to argue that we need some sort of framework to make sense of sort the good, the bad, and the indifferent. And then I'll end a little bit to make this case that the Christian faith and the church, I believe, has much to offer in this area, but I think is often too silent. And I quite like this quote I put here from The Heart of Darkness. The Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler. Rubashov is fighting against this totalitarian regime and that just looks at the logic of decisions and we're sailing without ethical ballast. And I want to suggest that we need some ethical ballast as we approach this area of genetics today. So one of the challenges is, how do you gain an overview of this vast field? And I've found it quite helpful just to think of 4 areas of investigating DNA. You can read the code, you can copy it and duplicate it, you can edit the code, or you can store the code. So I just want to give you some examples of slotting in some of the advances in genetics into these 4 areas. So first of all, reading the code. This is probably the technology that's most widespread, and it's the most straightforward, just reading the genetic code itself. And because each human being has a unique code, apart from perhaps identical twins, it's a way to identify an individual. And that's been used to detect criminals, to convict criminals. It's been used to establish family relationships. It's even been used to establish, the victim of war and terrorism. Some of you may have done genetic testing, ancestry testing, tracing your genetic origins as well. That's become very popular in recent years. So that's one area. I think healthcare, this read the code has really penetrated into healthcare because your genetic makeup influences the response, for example, to treatments. Then it's moving towards adapting a treatment to a particular genetic background, so-called precision or personalized medicine. Can also avoid adverse reactions to drugs, which are to genetic makeup. And more popularly, let's say, these direct-to-consumer tests have been used for things like developing exercise plan, nutritional adapted to your genetic makeup. And here the science is actually very weak, but the market seems ready. The one I've put on at the bottom here is the first. This was sponsored by Dragon's Den, if you ever watched that TV program, the first genetically personalized milkshake, I think it said, or meal shake. And then the last one I've put there, selection. So because, again, that unique geneticity can be characterized, it can be used to select people. And perhaps most commonly we're seeing this embryo selection to avoid certain genetic conditions. I think there are now, last time I looked, there are 1,700 genetic conditions listed on the Human Fertilization Embryo Authority website that are authorized for testing embryos and making decisions about which embryos to implant. There's also been concern, though, that these same genetic indicators could be used to discriminate against people for life insurance or jobs. I even saw it leaking into the sort of DNA romance, this dating, online dating, seeing whether you're genetically matched to a certain partner. Again, the science is weak, but these things are permeating through into everyday life. I just want to make one important point at this stage about this genetic testing. So there are several thousand conditions where just a damage in a single gene will lead to that condition. But that's really the exception. Most of those are rare. The vast majority of diseases or physical or behavioral are contributed to by hundreds or thousands of different sites in your DNA, combined with the effects of environment and lifestyle. So if you can just bear that in mind, that there is very rarely a gene for something. Okay, copying the code, cloning. This, I think, is an area that's died down a little bit. It was very, it was around the turn of the century with the cloning of the donor. But again, that technology has been superseded recently by more effective ways of achieving that goal. What is still going on is the cloning of high-value animals, so farm animals in the US in particular, but also pets. I like this company. I like the name anyway, Perpetuate, who will clone your pets. Barbara Streisand had a dog cloned, costs about $50,000 to do that. President of Argentina, it says that he draws a lot of strength from his cloned dogs, the current president. That's happening, but not in humans. Genetic engineering, editing the code. This, I think, is the area of the science at the moment that's most exciting, that's moving most rapidly. I'll just give you a little bit of background on this. The application can be across all life forms. Some of the early engineering was of bacteria to produce insulin. It can be used to repair faulty sequences in somatic cells. So that child's example I gave you right at the beginning. The first patient, Victoria Gray, was treated for sickle cell disease using this technology. So taking her marrow cells, repairing the error in the gene and putting those cells back into the body. And that relieved her of that disease. Costs can be extremely high. Single patient can cost up to $1 million for some of these gene therapies. But the patient can be cured for life, so you have no need for long-term treatment. But the cost is a question at this point. So those are cases where you change one particular tissue in the body. The one at the bottom, human germline genome editing, this is where either the sperm or the eggs or the very early embryo are subject to a genetic edit. And in that case, you may have all the cells in the body which are altered. There was a lot of controversy a few years ago, 5-6 years ago now, when this Chinese scientist, Dr. He, edited two embryos, human embryos, and two baby girls were born, two twins, with the genetic change that he'd introduced. And there's a great fear about this because you don't know how precise you start throwing these reagents into an embryo, where else in their genes if you made changes. So there's a lot of controversy about that. And also you're introducing that change into the human lineage, if you like. So that's one area that at the moment, many countries have banned that type of genetic editing. And just to fill out the picture a little bit here, I'll go through these quickly. Xenotransplantation. So the lack of organ donors has meant that people are looking for alternative ways to supply human organs. And one of the ways that the work is going is genetically engineering pigs. Engineering that the pig's organ is not recognized as foreign by the human body, so that you can then, the first patient, David Bennett, a couple of years ago now, received a pig heart in an organ transplant, genetically engineered, and he sadly died a few weeks later from that procedure. But that's the way that work is going. There's also work to try and for a mixture of animal and human embryos, but perhaps again those cells would be more genetically compatible with human beings for transplants. Genetically engineered crops, I think most people are aware of that area of the science. There have been great promises there to solve the problem of food insecurity. Now there's a tendency to present these also as part of what's been termed climate smart agriculture to try and combat climate change. I'll come back to that later. Gene Drive is quite a modern technology aimed at eliminating pests by genetic engineering. So most of the work at the moment has gone into mosquitoes, trying to make those mosquitoes sterile so that they cannot transmit malaria. Closer to home, there's been a question about whether we can use this to eliminate or reduce the grey squirrel in competition with the indigenous red squirrel here in the UK. It seems to me like that's a bit of an accident waiting to happen, Gene Drive. Once you release that technology into the environment, it's very difficult to know where it will go. A lot of interest in bioweapons linked with genetic engineering and artificial intelligence. Because the sequence, the DNA sequence of a lot of these pathogens is available publicly, there are efforts to modify, to make those pathogens more dangerous for human beings. And there's a lot of interest, I guess, in the military in those sorts of technologies. And then a lot more hype than substance, but you may have seen in the news several occasions where it's been proposed to de-extinct, if that's a word, some species that have become extinct by using some remaining DNA from specimens of those animals and create a new version. So lots of different areas of engineering. And then just to finish off this description of the areas of which genetic technology touches, I think we can think about saving the code. And this is mainly around patents and databases. So there's a huge amount of commercial interest in owning DNA sequences through patenting. Promises a lot of commercial benefits. And those have helped develop the development of medical diagnostics, for example, new drugs, crops, herbicides, and so on. About a quarter, the last time I looked, of human genes have one or more patents on them. And then DNA databases are proliferating. So I put 3 examples up here. The UK Police National DNA Database has about 6 million individuals on it. The NHS database, I think, will move towards having the genome of, well, they're looking at the moment of children being whole genome sequenced at birth. And eventually, I think, seeing that move into healthcare. And also, of course, the voluntary inclusion. So many of us have sort of sent off a sample of our DNA to Ancestry DNA, or other companies are available, and agree to research, and our DNA is lodged in those databases, the data and the DNA. And this is worth a lot of money. 23andMe signed a deal with GSK, I think, 5 or 6 years ago, to give them access to the DNA databases for $300 million. And I think the company is going bust at the moment and has sold its data as a way of winding up the company. So there's a lot of concern about the control of DNA data, the security, the confidentiality, but also what uses can it be put to that were not the original intended use when you signed up. So a number of challenges, I guess, as well as a lot of benefits of this technology, particularly in medicine at the present time. So, we can be just overwhelmed by this range of advances in genetics. How can we make some sense of this? How do we avoid, at worst, scaremongering, but at best leaving people not knowing how to make sense, how to make personal or collective decisions? My feeling is we need some sort of framework that can encompass all these areas, both now and into the future. I think if we had such a framework, it has to be meaningful to people, it has to be relevant and practical, and applicable to people that can't understand all the science. So it has to be relevant and accessible. I think it should be value-based, not just technical. A lot of the arguments that are put forward are about whether something is safe or not. But I think we need to go further than just whether something is safe or not. And I think some biblical foundation can be helpful there in this sort of marketplace of ideas, if you like. And because a lot of these areas are quite sensitive and personal, I've tried to take an approach which is an aid to thinking rather than a prescriptive approach, and hence what I've termed the relationship test. So why choose relationships as a framework for looking at some of these very complex areas? I think first of all, in general, relationships are central to what it means to be a human being. And so they're relevant and universal. I think everybody can identify with this, whatever your faith or no faith. So it gives us a common ground for discussion. Looking more specifically at it from a Christian perspective, I think the importance of relationships is clear. God's nature is relational. See some arguments that even within the Trinity there is relationship. And relationships are how God's love is enabled to be exhibited in the world. And Christians are called into relationship with God and other people. And you may think that this is how we image God in the world. This is how God's love is demonstrated through relationships. And the two great commandments, of course, point to that. So if an advance in genetics is impinging on core relationships, I think that's an indicator that we need to take this seriously. I think you can go even to a more fundamental level and say that we can operationalize this and say, what's the effect of this genetic advance on different types of relationship? But underneath that, we're really saying what action or decision allows the best expression of God's love. And I think that concern can appeal well beyond a purely Christian audience. Lord Rees, I like very much this comment that he made. He has no Christian faith, but he was talking about the world's religions and their impact on the way the world is shaped. And he said this: transnational communities that think long-term and care about the global community, especially the world's poor. So I think there's a sense in which this approach can resonate beyond one particular faith community. So I selected 4 areas for the relationship test. Relationship with self, how we think about ourselves, relationship with family, relationship with society that we live in, and relationship with the world, with the environment, and the other organisms we share that world with. And in terms of the practical steps, if you're taking a particular genetic advance and you want to evaluate it in this way, I think there are 3 broad components to that. I think it's worth thinking about the context of that genetic advance. What's the technology? What are the claims being made? What are the contentious areas? I think then you can try to identify some relevant principles and values, Christian principles and values. And then you can examine that impact on relationships of those 4 different types that I mentioned. So I thought in the second part of my talk, just to help think through this, I've given 2 practical examples, 2 worked examples. I don't think the details are important here, but I just want to give you a sense of how this might apply. So the first one are the genetically engineered crops, and the technology here is mainly editing or storing the code. I mean, this is an area that's exploded over the last 20 years or so. There's a 100-fold increase in the arable land handed over to GE crops. About 13% of all the land worldwide is now genetically engineered. Mainly different technologies to resistance to herbicides, pests, and so on, and this promise to combat food insecurity and climate change. Major focus, though, has been large-scale commercial crops protected by patents, suited to monocultures. That's been the technology. And just to say that the technology that's being used is moving from putting in a gene from one species to another to editing the genes of a particular crop, the genes that are already there. And the UK, since leaving the European Union, has been bringing through into legislation this Precision Breeding Act, which will enable us to have this type of genetically engineered crop in the UK. So what Christian principles and values might we bring to bear on this area? And I think biblically we're called to be active, care for and value God's creation. I know there's a lot of debate around the word stewardship, but I think it's stewardship combined with responsibility under God's authority. But I think there is a role there for human beings to play. I think there's a certain call for sustainability and respect of what is a shared resource, not to exhaust the resources now of the future. And I think that's about loving our neighbour and protecting the weaker and vulnerable in the world. I would say not all is as it was originally intended. So I think there's room for acts of restoration. And responsible use of nature for human benefit is valid in the context of what I've put in the points above. So if we think about genetically engineered crops then in terms of relationship with the world, first of all, safety, sustainability and care. What's the impact of this technology on those sorts of areas? Because when you genetically engineer a crop, you're suddenly introducing something quite new into the environment. There isn't that period of time as there is with selective breeding, where you can see how this is going. So from one day to the next, you're introducing a new crop. You can get gene flow, so some of the genes from that engineered crop can transfer into non-GE crops. And of course, there's all sorts of debates around the use of herbicides to go along with those crops. So some questions about safety and sustainability and care. I think one thing we're seeing is this huge biodiversity loss. And a proportion of that is linked to this large-scale monoculture. And that's not just GE crops, actually, that's in general. But we are seeing a narrowing of genetic diversity in the world's major food crops and less resilience, therefore, to change, such as climate change. If we think about relationships in society, so leaving behind the environmental effects, but what about the relationships with others in society? Inequality and control, I think, are 2 points to bear in mind. I mean, in practice, almost all the crops that have been developed are aimed at wealthy countries with companies that are selling combined seeds and herbicides. So we've not really seen in practice the application to crops adapted to drought areas, for example, or higher yields for those sorts of regions. But that doesn't mean we should throw the technology out, because those applications are possible. It's just that they've had less support. And control is one of the things that struck me the most about this area, that there's a real attempt by multinational companies to purchase small seed providers in different parts of the world. And that's reducing choice for farmers, in fact. And there is a concern that farmers may be pressured into buying GE seed rather than their normal practices. So I just put this down there. 3 companies now own and sell 2/3 of the world's patented seeds. It's a very narrow base. Also in society, injustice and exploitation. Patent law, it can cause farmers to lose the right to keep seed. And the vast majority of farmers in the developing countries have always saved seed and resown the next year. But this patent approach can interrupt that. And there have been some major court cases on that issue. And also just at the bottom, linked to genetics really is this biopiracy concern, that the benefits from indigenous plants and the associated knowledge is often being appropriated by wealthier countries, scientists and others in wealthier countries. So there's an effort at the UN level to try and develop some guidelines for fair sharing of those indigenous resources and knowledge. So in general, this is about protecting the weak and vulnerable in society. So that's one example on genetically engineered crops. Let me finish with a second one, which is on children's genes. And this technology is about reading and editing the code, those two categories. What's the context here? Well, genetic testing for selection, particularly in the context of IVF with pre-implantation embryos or prenatally with fetuses is developing. I think I mentioned earlier, the scope of that now is quite wide, and that can be a help, but it can also raise questions. Currently, there's no embryo gene editing permitted, but as I said, the research on that is continuing. So this is mostly being used to avoid serious genetic disability in combination with IVF. And that can be either to screen out those embryos and not implant the affected ones, but it can also be to prepare for treatment for a child that you know is going to be affected by a certain condition. Or in rare cases, it's been used to have a child that's a genetic match for an older sibling that's affected by a genetic disease. That's sometimes been referred to as savior siblings. I think what's happening more generally is that there's a widening sense of parental choice. If you're going down the route of IVF and there is some knowledge about what these different genetic makeups may influence, then that's becoming of interest to particularly to some commercial companies and to individuals. So, for example, sex selection of embryos is legal in the US, not in the UK. But just bear in mind the challenge of complex causes. As I mentioned earlier, most of these traits, behavioral or physical traits, are not determined by a single gene. So this is a practical barrier to that kind of approach being effective. What about the principles and values we might bring to bear in this area? I would say every person is made in the image and likeness of God, so it's of inherent value. I feel that implies everyone is of equal value in God's sight, so we shouldn't use another person as a means to an end. There's a sense, certainly biblically, that children are a gift from God to be protected and nurtured within a family or other support structure and received as equals into those relationships. And finally, this call for the vulnerable in society to be accepted, protected, and provided for. So just to give you an example where this technology is perhaps flipping from health-related avoidance of disease to something a bit different. This was the first child that was born looking at multiple genes in a set of embryos available to her parents, and they selected her because of a combination of genes which they were told would reduce her risk of disease later in life, heart disease, cancer, and so on. This is called a polygenic score because it's looking at multiple genes. There's not been any demonstration of clinical benefit of such a test, but this company, Genome Prediction, offers that. And at the time they said that other parameters could have been included, but they didn't for reputational reasons. But I just thought it was an interesting case because the father said, he felt an obligation to give his child the best start in life. He was probably misled by the science, but you can see where the motive might come from to move in this direction. So what's happening here in terms of relationships? First of all, in the family, how might this technology affect relationships within the family? Well, I think there can be an element of manipulation, particularly if this move towards editing the genome of a child to achieve a certain goal other than a health-related one. And that might contrast whether you've got this selector and selected relationship. And that may contrast with receiving a child as a gift from God of inherent and unique value. Also, I think there's something about inequality that arises. It disrupts this parent-child relationship of equals to one of control and controlled, or could do. I mean, I am raising this as a possibility further down the line if we go down particularly some of the gene editing routes. And there's no escaping what somebody has done to your genes. If they're there for not just you, but also your offspring and on through the generations. And also we have to think about the sibling relationships. There's very little information about these children that were selected in order to treat an older sibling. Or indeed, when you realize as an older sibling that the next child in line has been selected in order not to be like you. And obviously these things can be discussed and addressed within families, but I think to go into the process without realizing that could be very harmful. What about relationships in society? There's some arguments that by continually selecting out certain genetic conditions, we're somehow narrowing what's accepted as normal within society, less acceptance of difference and the richness that people bring to society with very different backgrounds, including disability. And I do wonder whether eventually we risk putting potential pressure on parents, to avoid the burden, so-called, of suffering, of disability. Why bring that child into the world if you had a choice to avoid that? And who pays for that? So I'm concerned about that potential pressure on parents that decide not to accept some of these technologies. And inequality. The UK is really leading the world in proposing that every child has their whole genome sequenced at birth and that information is available. And there are risks. There are benefits to that in terms of picking up disease and perhaps enabling people to avoid disease later in life. But there's also questions of potential discrimination that I mentioned earlier. And just to take it to its extreme, and this is an extreme, it's not on our doorstep at the moment, but there's some transhumanist kind of ideas that if you start to really invest in producing the best genetic background you can in your children and your lineage, then we may not want to mix that with people that have not been enhanced in a similar way. Now this is, I'm saying this is going well beyond the science at the moment, but it is something that chimes a little bit with some of the transhumanist movement. So there is an alternative way, we can use this excellent technology of genetic diagnosis to prepare for having a child with those rare conditions. There's work going on to try and correct some of those faults in the womb so that child is born healthy. And I think we need to think about the solidarity and care and support for affected families. You can't just expect people to do this alone. So particularly to reduce the consequences of disability. So let me just finish. I have 2 slides to finish now. And please do take those just as examples of the way of working through rather than hang on to the specifics. It was very late in my scientific career that I realized the gap between research and policy and guidelines. I sort of imagined that the policymakers would see the science and then make astute decisions based on that. And it took me a long time being at WHO actually to see the huge chasm that we have to cross, and many scientists not interested in doing it. And I think there's a similar thing here with the church and the Christian faith, that we have a lot to offer, I believe, not just to the Christian community, but to the community in general. But to do that, we need to be in on the discussion. So I feel that major Christian denominations should seek to work together and join with other faiths where we share common values to put forward a faith perspective on some of these really quite striking advances. And we need to be there at these discussions about international treaties and guidelines. Former director of the Director General of the WHO said to me once, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. You're on the menu. And so it really convinced me that we need a seat at the table. And then there's an example recently from the World Council of Churches on climate justice, which I think is a good model, actually. So here are my conclusions. Applications of genetics are manifold, significant, but unless we come to grips with it, we may end up being consumers and not critics or contributors. We may sail without ethical ballast in society. There are many, many positive applications, but also challenges and risks underpinned by some questionable motives. So I think it's quite right to critique an approach in a balanced way. I do believe that this approach of relationships is a useful framework to evaluate these, both on a personal level, but also collectively. And we're called to be salt and light. And I think we have to make our case in a world which does not always share our faith, of course, with love and humility in the face of what are some really sensitive personal areas. But thankfully, we have a model. I'm amazed by how Christ was able to bring sacred values to bear in the midst of imperfection, an imperfect world, but always couched in love. And I feel that's, as always, a good model for us. So thank you for your attention to that. Oh, and the least important slide, there is a book coming out on this by the end of June, I hope. So if you're interested in the subject matter, please look out for that in the future.
Thank you, Chris. And we have plenty of time now for questions and discussion. If you are online, apologies for some of the technical issues, but if you can see and hear us, please put questions in the Q&A box. And if anyone here would like to kick the questioning off, to jump in.
Thanks so much, Chris. Obviously, our culture has a heritage of Christian values that have shaped the way that our law and our society run. In your experience of scientific policy and ethics, how much of that Christian heritage do you think is still underlying the policies that people are making, and how much where are we particularly beginning to move away from some of those Christian assumptions we would have had 100 years ago, and actually they're just not being held on to anymore?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I'm just trying to think, because I spent a lot of my career internationally. So I was in a mix, and in an international organization, you're specifically not meant to bring that kind of faith explicitly to bear, I suppose, in the workplace. No, I think if what we profess is the best for human beings, then that will resonate beyond people that just share our specific faith. So I do think it's about how we present that case, the language that we use. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think in medicine, I see it still very much underpinning. In science, perhaps people don't understand really the Christian drive for curiosity and discovery in science. And so I see that as part of the Christian underpinnings of research and science. So in short, no, I don't think it's disappeared, but I think it's not perhaps recognized as such. And, there's been a few interesting books recently on this sort of rise of cultural Christianity. I think that Tom Holland is the one of the specific people that's pointed to that. I think that can only take us so far because it's looking at a common denominator, but there are some very specific things. And I think there we need a unique voice as well as being part of a more general shared set of principles.
Thank you. It strikes me that lots of different Christians can look at the same verses or even hold the same values and come to different opinions about what they're comfortable with. And I just wonder how you think about, are we good at disagreeing well? And do we all have to have the same opinion to be helpful and at the table?
Yeah, as I was thinking about this what is the Christian perspective? It's very, as you say, there are different people come to different conclusions. So I think we're often not that good at disagreeing well. How can we get around that? I feel we have to explain where we're coming from. What's the root of our position, rather than just state something. So that often teases out some of the weaknesses, but also be respectful about somebody who then differs. So, for example, on the human embryo question and the testing, I'm always keeping two questions in my mind. What do I believe? But what would I do if I was facing that situation, let's say with a severe disability that was life-ending in a young child? What would I do? So I think being very honest about the limits of our knowledge and the fact that we might be wrong can help. But I do think there's perhaps more common ground than we sometimes think. We maybe focus too much on the areas of conflict than on the areas of agreement. But it wouldn't be easy to get the Church of England to come up with one position, would it, on something?
So there's a question here online about how can we develop a framework that can be used to evaluate future and therefore unknown genetic advances?
Yeah, well, actually, that's what I was hoping to do by this approach. So then it doesn't depend on dealing with what's known currently. It's saying, can you slot that new advance into that framework? Because what I found when I first got interested in this area was I was just chasing conundrums. A new report would come out in the press on something new. And I thought, well, how am I going to make a mind up about that? There's a recent one in, you can now generate sperm and eggs from skin cells. So, you can overcome the need for sperm and egg for fertilization. And so I thought, I can't just keep chasing conundrums and throwing up new challenges, and I have to find some way of putting this into a framework. And that's why I thought about the relationships, because it's relevant, it does resonate with people, it's important, and it seems able to accommodate all these different advances. So that's what I'm aiming at. Whether it works or not, we have to see.
Okay, we have a couple in the room that will come to.
Thank you so much for that talk and for putting it into such a sort of ordered framework for us to think about. I was particularly following through your example of GE crops. And it seems to me, and it fits across the piece, that it's who has control that is absolutely fundamental to some of this. And many of the people who are pretty anti-GE crops are not anti because of the sort of science and technology, but they're anti because of the control that has been taken by, just a few multinationals and the impact that that's had on poor farmers around the world, losing their resilience and sustainability and so on. So, but I find it very hard to address that issue because that's how, it seems to progress along all of these scientific pathways. Somebody gets control and then it can't be used for the greater good.
Yeah, that's a really important point and observation, actually. I mean, that's why I tried at the end to make the case for the church, and not just the church. I'm saying the church because that's my faith background, but, I think we have to be there at the decision points. I've been involved in a number of discussions about gene editing of embryos. There was I was saying earlier to Graham, there's nobody there from a theology background or from a faith background putting a perspective on the foundation of intellectual thinking and belief. So we should be at the table before those decisions are made and running away with themselves, I feel. But you're right to say it's not the technology per se, it's the motives and application which are the problem, particularly with the GE crops. So we ended up with, I think, a really unfortunate situation with this golden rice, which is engineered to have a high vitamin A content and combat vitamin A deficiency in the developing world. And Greenpeace and others I know have been against it. And I think partly just on principle, because of all the baggage that comes with some of the other GE crops. And I felt that, we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater at that point. I think that's unfortunate. But I guess the answer is to have a seat at the table where the decisions are being made and to try to rein in some of the excesses of power and control that I mentioned. It's not easy.
I was struck by how some of the same ethical questions that you raised are similar to questions discussed in the context of assisted dying and the pro-life debate, etc. And I'm just curious, there are significant Christian and other movements addressing those issues. Are there grassroots movements within the church addressing this issue? And are there efforts being made to raise awareness about this issue in those sorts of groups? Because those might be the people that would care about it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think on some of the climate justice side, the sort of eco-theology, as it's termed, I think there has been a grassroots movement because of the critique of the church sort of 40, 50 years ago, that the attitudes were about exploiting the world. I think there was a good response to that, and there seems to be several organisations that are putting good arguments forward and are recognised as being involved in the debate. I think in this area, I've not been able to find any. It's why the reason I'm still speaking about it when I should be retired and at home doing something else, right? Because I just don't see the commitment to this. Even in some of the science areas, I don't see quite as much about the genetics, and yet for me, it's transforming. And I think one of the problems is the disparate nature of the applications. So you can't easily get your head around the fact of what this is collectively, and that at core, it's a set of technologies which are just being applied in different areas. So no, I think there's a need for that. I'm hoping somebody will pick this up and also get, World Council of Churches or Pontifical Academy of Sciences, these organizations that might be able to have a voice which individual Christians just won't be able to manage on their own.
Just a comment, we need to go back to Faraday, who's anti-patent, because no one can own God's creation. I did not know that. I presume this person means Michael Faraday. So yes, as a geneticist, the 1/4 of genes being under some kind of patent, I find surprising. And I remember Francis Crick, who resigned from being head of Human Genome Project because he thought that was wrong.
Collins, yes, yeah, that's right.
I think
Crick
stepped down.
Yeah.
Collins stepped in.
Yeah,
But so I wanted to ask about your work on the expososome. I know you've been working on cancer. Your own research was on a slightly different topic on exposure to environmental things, and then cancer risks. Is there an interface with what you've just been talking about and the principle you've been talking about there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think what happened was I was working on the environmental cause of cancer, and we knew that the vast majority of cancers are not caused by genes on their own. They're caused by environmental and behavioral factors. But all the money was going into the genetics, particularly around the sequencing of the genome. So I thought, how can I redress this balance? Because this is not going to solve the problem. What we need to know is what the environment and lifestyle factors are. So I proposed this exposome to complement the genome rather than contest it, to complement it and say, well, you actually need both. You need both halves of the equation to solve it. So yes, my research was on genes and environment, and then it got me thinking, well, what else is genetics influencing other than research funding, which is slipping away from my area? And I just got fascinated by the set of applications, and thinking that as a Christian, surely we've got something to say about this. So yes, there was a link, because I was looking at genes and environment together, and I got interested more in the ethical aspects of the field.
who decides and how is it defined what's a disability that counts as a health issue and what is a disability that doesn't? So is short-sightedness that requires someone to wear glasses as that disability? Is blindness? Is deafness? Is colour blindness? Is autism or dyslexia? Are these things that could justify a fetus being edited in the womb or an embryo not being selected? And who decides where to draw the line?
Yeah.
Who has that authority?
That's a good. Is it that time already? No, and this, of course, that question is the key question. I remember years ago reading an excellent book by Tom Shakespeare, who is, you may have seen, he suffers from dwarfism, and he wrote a book about politics and disability, which for me was very influential. I mean, he proposed that with some of the genetic single gene disabilities, that you could say the very serious ones, the ones that are life-limiting and cause a lot of pain, discomfort early in life, and then the child doesn't have a long life. But even there, it's actually very difficult to say, well, where do you draw this line? Once you move away from that to things which are not set in stone by single genes, but are the combinations of many, many genes, you can't really do that. You could describe it as a disability, but it wouldn't be a genetic. There wouldn't be a genetic solution to that, if I can put it that way. So I think the big challenge is of these 1,700 conditions that you can now screen embryos for. If you look at the total number of genetic counsellors in the UK, it's about 300, and their workload is increasing, and their numbers are not going up. So one of the concerns is that the test result may have a huge influence on parents simply because they don't get access to understand the detailed consequences of any particular gene. And then within that gene, different changes have more or less impact on the child, on the person. So for the same gene, depending where the alteration is that's causing the fault, you can get very severe condition or a relatively mild condition. And we're only just learning through AI, actually, which of those mutations might be more severe or less severe. So I think it's what the question poses, a huge challenge, even just within the narrower area of genetic testing and disability. Notwithstanding the questions about what are we losing by the lack of, loss of diversity in our communities and the lessons we can learn from each other with different backgrounds.
Don't forget the Faraday course on neurodiversity. It's also coming up in October. November, we'll continue to explore this question. Now, your last challenge in the last 2 minutes is to answer 2 questions that we have online. I'm sure you can do it. How can we begin to have a voice in this debate? There's little chance for most of us to understand the complex scientific processes involved. And another person says, genome sequencing in newborns removes their autonomy. How should we respond?
Okay, so the first one, what I think of 3 levels. I think personal. So can we equip people to feel confident to make their own decisions? That we have to do in the society we're in. Secondly, I think church leaders and pastors being equipped to counsel people in their churches, I think, is important, and that we can also address by training and familiarity with the issues. And then, if we want to really shape society, I think we have to have representation on the key decision-making groups. We have to, get in touch with these parliamentary groups, Christian groups in Parliament that might put this forward, or people in the House of Lords that might champion a particular area. Or we have to get involved on the committees that Royal Society sets up or the WHO sets up. So we have to have a seat at the table And I think that's more powerful if it's organizations rather than individuals. So, for example, I've tried with the Anglican Church in this country to get some traction on this, but I don't think people are going to listen to me. So, but that's the kind of thing. There needs to be a group, in my view, on that organization that looks at these issues, on the World Council of Churches and others. So the person is right. An individual can't do this. The second one was about the autonomy of the child. Yeah, I think in terms of the selection, you're not changing. You're choosing out of a range of, sounds awful, but choosing out of a range of embryos that are present. I think the real danger would come if we got into editing embryos, because there is no choice, and you've made. So you can walk away from your piano lessons that your parents tried to get you to take, but you can't walk away from your genes. So I think there the question of autonomy is real. The only parallel I thought was with vaccination. We vaccinated our children to protect them against certain diseases. So we changed their biology without their permission. But the good of that was very clear, and it was a collective good. It's a herd effect. So we're also doing something for society. So I think that does differ. But I would draw a distinction between the selection is bad enough, but at least you're choosing somebody that was already there. The editing would be the one where it would really be a red flag to me in terms of autonomy.
Well, they're fascinating. We will have to draw stumps there. Thank you very much, Chris, for coming and speaking to us today.
Thank you.